Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Pete Timmerman. I'm the director of the Webster University Film Series. You're here for the opening night event of Anime with Satoshi Kon, or Kon Satoshi, if you prefer. I'm going to do a quick introduction of myself and the film series, mostly the film series, before I hand over the floor to our speaker today, Adam Manfredi. So to start, if you aren't familiar with us and what we do, the Webster University Film Series is St. Louis's only year-round nonprofit movie theater. We've been in operation for 42 years, actually a little more than 42 years, but 42 years officially. It was a student film society prior to that. Normally speaking, we show movies in person in the Winifred Moore Auditorium, which is in Webster Hall on Webster University's main campus down in Webster Groves. I know some of you are WashU students, so I would encourage you to come down to our campus and see movies. It's sort of like the difference between watching a movie at home and watching a movie at your friend's house. If you're watching a movie at home, you're just being lazy. But if you're watching a movie at a friend's house, you're being social. So you should come down to our campus and see a movie with the film series and be social. But anyway, we haven't been able to show movies in person since March of last year. And I'm told that I probably shouldn't expect to go back to in-person screenings until August of this year. So we have a few more months of not being able to show things in person. In the meantime, we've been doing a lot of virtual things, as you presumably know, because you're here right now. We've done quite a few virtual speaking events. But aside from that, we also have a virtual theater where we've been booking new films and new restorations of older films that we would have liked to have booked in person, but we just can't because we're not showing anything in person. You can access these movies. The best way to do it, I think, is from our website. It's webster.edu/film series. You can also get to them if you follow us on social media. We're at WU Film Series on both Twitter and Instagram, and at Webster Film Series on Facebook. But we always provide the links and things there. There's like an email newsletter we can get you on and things like that if you prefer. But anyway, as we speak, I have two movies in the virtual cinema. One is the movie from the Congo, well, Democratic Republic of Congo. It's called Downstream to Kinshasa, but that leaves after tonight. That one's a $10 rental for 7 days, though. So if you're inclined to watch it, and I would hope that you would, I think it's a great documentary. The documentarian Dodo Hamadi was feted at the True False Film Festival back in 2018. It's just his newest feature. But if you were to rent it tonight, despite the fact that it closes with us after tonight, you'll still have the full 7-day window to watch it. So if you rent it after tonight's event, you can watch it at a leisurely pace over the next week. And then also we have the new version of Berlin Alexanderplatz, which is about 3 hours long, which is to say that it's 12 and a half hours shorter than the Rainer Werner Fassbinder adaptation of the same material from 1980. And then opening tomorrow, we have one new film in the virtual theater. It's called The County. The County is an Icelandic, French, German, Danish co-production. It's mostly Icelandic. The director is Icelandic and the language they speak is Icelandic. But it's about a farmer in rural Iceland who is forced to sell her wares through a local co-op who are basically run like a mafia and her rebelling against that co-op. But that'll open with us tomorrow. Like I said, check out webster.edu/film series to rent these films. Then next, I wanted to thank, we do have a sponsor this month for the Satoshi Kon series. It's the Japan America Society of St. Louis. So I wanted to be sure to thank them and also point out Japan America were the ones that introduced me to tonight's speaker, Adam Manfredi, as well as next week's speaker. Like I said, tonight is the first night of the Kon series. So next week, we've got Elsie Shanez, who, Elsie, I haven't spoken to you yet. I'm sorry if I just butchered your name. I see that you're in the audience. But she's going to speak about a Millennium Actress. And then 2 weeks from tonight, we have Ethan Halker on Tokyo Godfathers. And then the final event this month is Justin Sevickas, who will be speaking about Paprika. Justin Sevickas was actually the last person to interview Satoshi Kon in English before he died, or for an English language interview. But yeah, so we've got a good month of events in front of us. I also wanted to mention before I forget, this is kind of apropos of nothing, but I feel like it's appropriate for me to say so. We very often work with Cinema St. Louis, the people that put on the St. Louis International Film Festival. We aren't working with them on this event. I don't mean to give you the impression that they're part of this. They aren't. So if I embarrass myself, I'm embarrassing myself alone. But they do a similar speakers series. But this coming Monday, they've got kind of a doozy. They have Mark Harris, who just wrote the really popular biography of Mike Nichols. And he's speaking about Mike Nichols. He's speaking about the Mike Nichols film, Carnal Knowledge from 1971. But if you wanted to get to that event, it's free. You just sign up for free. It's pretty much like this, but it's them instead of us doing it. But that's at cinemastlouis.org. That's Monday night at 7:30 p.m., I think. Maybe don't quote me on the time. I guess a couple last thoughts. One is, if this is your first one of these events and you like it and you wonder what you've missed, we've been archiving these discussions on our YouTube channel, which we only recently started, so I'm not sure if you even know that it exists. But if you get on YouTube and just search Webster University Film Series, you'll find them. They started back in February, so we have about 15 of them. I think a little less, 13 by now. And then lastly, before I hand over the floor, if you have any questions at any point during the presentation, Adam's presentation is going to be something like half an hour long, give or take. But at any point, feel free to drop in questions in the Q&A box. Adam will ignore them when they come through, but then when his presentation is over, I'll read the questions from the audience to Adam and he'll answer them. But yeah, it's kind of nice to go directly into audience questions instead of having me fumble with my own. So don't be shy if you have questions along the way. It's nice to plop them in there at any time. But anyway, our speaker tonight is Adam Manfredi, who is a PhD candidate at WashU in Japanese literature. And like I said, he was recommended to me from my friends at Japan America Society at St. Louis, and we're really happy and grateful to have him. And with that, I'll get out of the way. Adam?
Thank you for the introduction. I'll hopefully be able to share my screen correctly and get my PowerPoint up. Okay, so welcome. I'm glad to see everyone here. I'll be presenting on Kon Satoshi's Perfect Blue. Just a note about names. I'll be giving the Japanese name order, which is the last name and then the first name, but feel free, if it feels more natural, to give the American name. Also, I'll be using the English versions of all the names of the titles just for simplicity's sake. And I'm really happy to present on Kon Satoshi, one of my favorite, not only anime directors, but directors, period. And I'll get into it. So I want to start with Kon's last words to his fans. So he died on August 24th, 2010, at the age of 46 from pancreatic cancer. And during his career, he kept a very active blog with which he communicated with his fans. And his family, the day after his death, published a final letter to his fans. And in it, he sort of summarizes what he thinks of himself as a director. And so I'll read that. Quote, "My biggest regret is the film Dream Machine. It's Kon's final unfinished work. I'm worried not only about the film itself, but about the staff with whom I was able to work with on the film. After all, there's a strong possibility that the storyboards that were created with our blood, sweat, and tears will never be seen. This is because I put my arms around the original story, the script, the characters, and the setting, the sketches, the music, every single image. Of course, there are things that I shared with the animation director, the art director, and other staff. But basically, most of the work can only be understood by me. It's easy to say that is my fault for arranging things in this way, but from my point of view, I made every effort to share my vision with others. However, my current state, I can only feel deep remorse for my inadequacies in these areas. I'm really sorry to all the staff. However, I want them to understand, if only a little bit. Kon Satoshi was, quote, that kind of person. And that's why I was able to make rather weird anime that was a bit different. I know this is a selfish excuse, but thinking of my cancer, please forgive me." So I hope that through this film series and the company lectures this month, you can get a sense of what Kon meant by that kind of person and enjoy his rather weird and a bit different anime. So Kon Satoshi was born October 12th, 1963, in Hokkaido. So it's the northern island in Japan. It's the most rural and remote island in Japan, but he grew up in the capital city, Sapporo, where his father worked. He died August 24th, 2010 in Tokyo. While in school, he became friends with a classmate, Takizawa Seiho, who went on to become a manga artist. And he joined the school manga and anime club and became interested in manga and anime from the older students. And he decided then in high school to become an animator. In order to pursue his studies, he went to Tokyo at Musashino Art University, one of the top universities in Japan, art universities, and studied graphic design. And in school, he became more interested in foreign films and the work of the science fiction author Yatsutaka Tsutsui, author of Paprika, who he would later adapt. And he actually was less interested in the contemporary manga and anime scene. Just a couple words. I'm sure most people, I would assume, might know this, but for those who don't, Japanese manga and anime like its American counterparts, often has books and series aimed at younger boys and girls, but there's also more a diversity in Japanese manga. So for example, one favorite examples is there's on the left here, Shima Kosaku Bucho, which means or division leader Shima Kosaku. And it's a weekly comic, a weekly manga about a businessman. It's been running for 30 years and it follows him from section leader to division leader to company head. And now I think he's a retired consultant. And this is a manga aimed at salarymen, at adults in Japan. And it's not uncommon for all age groups to read various types of manga or watch anime, as there are genres directed at various groups. So Kon started his creative work as a manga artist, a mangaka, in 1984. And he sort of broke in when he became an assistant to Otomo Katsuhiro, who's the creator of Akira, which is a very important work of manga and anime that I'll talk about briefly in a minute. And Kon continued working in manga throughout the 80s and early 90s, writing such works as Opus, which is one of his most important titles as a mangaka, which ran from 1995 to 1996, but was canceled unexpectedly. And in this title, he began to work with many of the themes that he would later explore in his film. And when I start talking about his films, I'll give a rundown of some of the major themes he tends to engage with. And in 1995, Kon was a scriptwriter, layout artist, and art director on the short film Magnetic Rose, which is part of Otomo's omnibus Memories. And it led to him his first directorial debut with Perfect Blue. So a little word about Akira and why it's important that Kon worked with the creator of this manga and anime. So Akira by Otomo Katsuhiro was a long-running manga from 1982 to 1990, and a film version of it came out in 1988. The manga inspired a new wave of more adult cyberpunk-influenced manga and anime in Japan, for example, Ghost in the Shell. And it also had an influence on American comics or English comics. So in mid to late 1980s, there was an increase in more adult comics coming out of the UK and the US, for example, Watchmen and Swamp Thing by Alan Moore, or The Dark Knight and Batman Year One by Frank Miller. And a lot of times they drew these inspirations from more adult-oriented comics manga from Japan, for example, Akira. But even more so than the manga, the 1988 film was widely important in spreading the knowledge about anime in America. Before Akira, anime in America was usually viewed as sort of cheap or poorly dubbed, mainly because the anime that came was oftentimes not fully translated or changed or shown only in the mornings or directed at children. Akira had a large budget behind it and promotional campaign, and it really introduced anime to the US, and particularly adult animation. And so this idea of animation for adults or geared towards adults that Kon Satoshi is a part of really has some of its origin in Akira. So starting with Perfect Blue 1997, Kon Satoshi went on to make 4 feature-length films in which he was the director and writer, and as you see from his blog post, really involved in every aspect of these films. And we can really think of him as an auteur. And I'll talk about a little bit later some of his fingerprints in terms of his thematic and also directorial style. He also produced 1 TV series, Paranoid Agent, in 2004. I'll briefly mention this. The other films you'll see, so I don't want to spoil anything, but many of you probably have not had the chance to watch Paranoid Agent. This was a 13-episode anime and English dub. So in 2004, the English dub appeared on Cartoon Network, Adult Swim in 2005. This was my first introduction to Kon Satoshi's work. Cartoon Network's Adult Swim was a adult-orientated animation block run at nighttime on Cartoon Network, and it included many anime and introduced many anime to America. For example, Cowboy Bebop and Gundam debuted on this series. And I was a big fan of it. And I saw Paranoia Agent, and it sort of blew me away. And then I went on and tried to find every one of his works after that. So in Paranoia Agent, each episode features a different protagonist, and episodes are loosely tied together. So a protagonist in one episode might have been a side character in the previous. And many of the episodes are based off of sort of current events in Japan, particularly a news story about a young boy who attacked some schoolmates with a bat. And he's the Shonen Batto, or young bat boy. And he becomes this sort of mythical character in this TV show. It was created while Kon was making Tokyo Godfathers. And there is one particular episode which is actually all about the making of an anime. It's sort of a meta episode. And they actually had originally wanted to film Kon, Satoshi, and his group making an anime, but they decided that having it be an animated version would be better. And essentially, Kon describes it as all these ideas he had from other movies that he loved, but couldn't really either fit into one of his movies he made or create a whole movie out of it. And so he linked them together in this long story. So after you watch all the films, I really suggest you go out and check out Paranoia Agent also. So moving on to some of Kon's themes, and you'll see these really, they almost all appear in Paranoia Agent, but they appear throughout, they all appear in Perfect Blue, but you can see them throughout his filmography. There's a lot of dualities, public versus private, dreaming versus waking, fiction versus reality, on-screen versus off-screen. You see often appearance of doppelgangers. This is very apparent in Perfect Blue. Memories and the connections between the past and the present, fandom, celebrities, the role of technology, mental illness and trauma. Particularly the role in technology in Perfect Blue is very prescient for current days. Came out in '97 when, there was the internet, but it was not what it was today. But Kon was an early adopter of technology, was very active in blogging. And so he saw how celebrity culture would be now in terms of internet personalities and the internet image. You can see that in other films, particularly in Paprika, the role of technology. Perfect Blue came out in 1997. This was Kon's first feature as a director, and he co-wrote it with Mirai Sadayuki. It was made on a modest budget of only $800,000. His next film would cost about 50% more, and the one after that double, and the final one triple, as he became more successful. It was loosely based on a novel of the same name by Takeuchi Yoshikazu. However, they agreed that it really wasn't suitable, the original novel, in many ways for the film. And so he was able to change it a lot to keep sort of the basic idea, but explore many of the themes that he wanted to. It was animated by the studio Madhouse, which is the animation studio behind the rest of Kon's works. And when marketing Perfect Blue, they used Kon's past association with Otomo, the creator of Akira, to really promote the film overseas. Akira had gotten huge press, still 10 years previous, but was really well known. And this got his foot in the door in many international film festivals, and where it was quite successful, and he started to make it a name for himself. So if you watch Perfect Blue, you've probably noticed that there's a shot-by-shot a shot that is used is recreated in Requiem for a Dream. And you can also see a similarity between Perfect Blue and Black Swan. Kon's work has also been acknowledged influence on Nolan, for instance, in Inception. And so he's a director who is sort of a director's director. And many American and international film directors have been influenced by his films. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Kon's style. I really think that approaching him as an auteur is a very fruitful way of thinking about his works, because you can see not only thematic connections throughout all his works, but also really stylistic choices. So first, I'm going to mention a few different sort of Kon styles, particularly in his editing. And then I'm going to look at particularly how he uses the match cut in Perfect Blue. So in terms of his animation style, you would call it more realistic. Obviously, in something like Paprika, where there's dream sequences, there's quite fantastical images. but in general, it's a more realistic and grounded anime. This is in contrast to the animation style popular in the late 90s, which you can see on the left. This image is from Perfect Blue, and it's used as kind of maybe a commentary on his style. This image is seen on the door to a anime shop, and it opens up, and it's contrasted with three men who leave, who are very normal and maybe even ugly. And you could argue that a lot of his characters they're not beautiful, they're not idealized images, except the ones who play actors, or the ones who are actors or are singers, and who are meant to be those sort of literally idols. Also, the animation in Perfect Blue, Kon himself says it wasn't his best or his favorite. They were on a smaller budget, and so the quality animation really improves, I think, as the films go on. However, his technical editing and style is really present in Perfect Blue, and I think that this is the thing that marks it the most as his film. You can see other stylistic choices he makes and things he's sort of obsessed with, and one is reflections or images in screens. And so you oftentimes see characters through reflections throughout the film or screens. He often uses a sort of a trick where you don't realize you're seeing a reflection at first, or you don't realize you're looking at a screen until he pulls out. Example of this is this is in the beginning of the film during the initial 5-minute montage. And we have an image of Mima being thrown onto a bed. We're not given a establishing shot or really told where we are. The next image is the same scene, but now pulled out with these lines on it, which we learn is a television. And so there's a lot of movements back and forth between images and then the representation of images. And you see this theme throughout his filmography. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about the concept of a graphic match. So this is arguably the most famous graphic match in cinema, I would say. 2001: A Space Odyssey. If you remember, there's a scene where the monkeys or the pre-humans are around the monolith in ancient times, and they throw up this bone, and it cuts to a spaceship flying in space. And so in this, there's a graphic match, which is the bone and the spaceship have a similar shape, similar size, similar position on the screen. There's also arguably a match on action. As the bone moves, the spaceship is moving at the same time. So match cuts are an important part of cinema. They're used both in continuity editing, that is editing that tries to hide cuts that move seamlessly between scenes, but also in editing that tries to make contrast between scenes. So here, the cut is obvious, especially because of the background, the different objects. But because of the graphic match, we make a parallel between these two objects. Kon, throughout Perfect Blue, uses match cuts for a variety of reasons. And he also uses sound bridges too, as a way of moving between scenes. So this is a GIF from early in the movie. We have Mima on stage as part of Cham, and her in her everyday life. She turns and she's in the supermarket. We get several of these images early in the montage. And here, the match cut, both on action and later on sound too, instead of making a seamless move between the two, it creates a very distinct line between her public and private life. Although the action movement connects the two, her clothing and the lighting and the colors really make this clear distinction. We all see this. So she's on the train, she's singing the song, it's quiet in her earphones. It cuts to her with the same hand movement, singing the same song. But as it cuts between the two, the song grows louder and now is her fully singing it. And again, there's a very sharp distinction between her private life and her public life. Again, we see this when she's opening the door, entering her apartment. It cuts to her exiting out to a large crowd. Here, it's very quiet, and then suddenly the sound bridges from one shot to the other, and it's quite loud. And so we see this clear distinction that, as the film goes on, breaks down. Another example where Kon uses a match cut, but in a more subtle way, and also I would argue slightly confusing way, comes when Mima comes to her office, and the members of Cham are celebrating their first top 100 hit. And so she's standing outside the room, the members are inside, and they're popping these little poppers. There's a close-up of a popper, and then it cuts to Mima holding the same color popper. And so you have both you have a graphic match on the image, but also a sound match, because we hear the popper sound here in the first shot and in the second shot. We see then that we are now in the past, right before Cham's first performance, when another of the members is comforting Mima and telling her that the performance will go successfully. This is when she's still part of an idol. As her bandmate pats her on the shoulder, it cuts to the present, where Rumi, her current manager, is trying to comfort her. And this type of transition is used repeatedly throughout the film, and it gets more and more confusing about where we are in time and space. Example of this is later on in the film, where Rumi, her manager, is trying to comfort Mima in her room, places her hand on her shoulder, and then it cuts to a filming of Double Bind, where her co-actress is patting her on the shoulder. And in here, we hear Rumi's voice, and Mima asking her a question that Mima asks her coworker, even though she is no longer in the same room. So we have this back and forth throughout the film, but as the film progresses, as Mima loses her coherence of distinctions between public and private, between dreams and reality, past and future and present, these cuts are more and more used to make the viewer also feel this disassociation, this confusion. Probably my favorite use of a cut, and this is a little bit more of a wipe, is when Mima is finally taken back, we think, to her apartment after she's been attacked. She's in a car, and we see in the background the Tokyo skyline. As the camera pans, we are suddenly in her room. So her head is almost used as a wipe cut to this room. And Kon does this a lot, transfers between scenes without establishing shots, in order to make the viewer unsure where they are, or sometimes think they're in one place but are in another. So this is something that I want you to look out for, these types of cuts, when you're seeing his other films, because he continues this out throughout his filmography, and I would say even becomes more extreme with it. You can see this particularly, I would argue, in Paprika. Really, he kind of expands how much you can do with animation. And after Perfect Blue came out, was success, everyone kept on asking Kon, are you gonna do live action next? When are you gonna do live action? It was sort of seen that although you could make a successful animated film for adults, it was still seen as a next step to do the live action. And Kon always said, I'm not interested in doing live action. And it wasn't necessarily that Kon was the hugest fan of anime and manga. Like, he didn't read a lot of contemporary works, and was much more influenced by Hollywood films. And you can see the influence from his cutting, so this use of these match shots and these transitions in films like Terry Gilliam's Brazil uses a lot of it, or the movie adaptation of Slaughterhouse-Five. However, Kon argued that the type of editing he did was too fast or too hard to do in live action, and that animated films gave him much more control over the editing process. And so I think it's a sort of an interesting idea that although he was influenced by these Hollywood films, he felt he could only do that through his animation. So I'm going to end this lecture by giving a little cultural background about idol culture and otaku culture in Japan, which play a prominent role in Perfect Blue. So otaku can be translated to nerd or geek in English, but especially in its origins has a much more of a negative connotation. than maybe nerd culture has now, which has become mainstream, I would argue. The term was first coined by essayist Nakamori Akio in 1983, and it was used to describe socially awkward fans who were said to address each other in overly polite terms. So the term otaku comes from the Japanese word for another person's house, and it's an honorific. It's often used metaphorically in Japanese as a second person pronoun for you. And in Japanese, honorifics are quite important, especially when you meet someone for the first time. There's this big idea of inside group and outside group in Japan. And meeting someone from your outside group, you need to use various honorifics, especially if the person is above you or if you're in customer service. However, the rumor or sort of what people said about these otaku was they used this honorific term in situations where they've known someone for a long time and where a normal person, a non-otaku, would transfer to a much more familiar pronoun or way of referencing a friend. And so this misuse of the word indicated their social awkwardness, and so was coined the term otaku. However, the word gained very notoriety and infamy in 1989 when a 26-year-old man named Miyazaki Tsutomu was arrested and later sentenced to death for killing 4 young girls. And when the police searched his room, they found thousands of videotapes, including anime and slasher films. And the mass media dubbed Miyazaki the Otaku Murderer. And so we see his room here on the right, and we can see a parallel between Meimania, the stalker of Mima's room, covered in posters and magazines and film. And so the talk shows began to use the term otaku to describe a person who was outwardly sort of innocuous and a little socially awkward, but who secretly might have become a criminal in the wrong circumstances. And so this was usually targeted at young men in their late teens or early 20s, and it became a very huge stigma on this culture that had just recently formed. So a little bit more on the origins of otaku culture. So otaku culture, it started in the late 1970s when a number of influential magazines started to be published that gave fans a source of information about the subculture of anime and manga and other related merchandise. And it also gave fans an opportunity to connect with each other through writing articles for these magazines, because they were sort of a mixing an amateur and a professional publication. And it allowed also fans to communicate with artists in the field. However, as Japan's economic bubble burst in the 90s, toy companies started to need new sources of income, and otakus were seen as a good customer. So it said about otakus that if they liked an anime or a manga and they were going to buy a toy from it, they would always buy 3. One for themselves to play with, to use, one to keep in the box as a collector's item, and one to give to a friend. And anime and other related products in the 90s really started to shift the target from young children to a broader age group, particularly otakus, who were usually men in their late teens or early 20s. Also, during this time, Japan started entering its graying time, where the population became much older and there were less children. And so with less children to target for these entertainment products, they really started to target otaku, who would spend a lot of money on products that some might view as childish. And there also was a lowering of people getting married. So a lot more single people and single men with more disposable income who weren't having families. And so this is sort of the view of the rise of otaku culture. And I didn't mention it, but the first image here is sort of the otaku area of Tokyo, Akihabara, where much of Perfect Blue presumably takes place. Started out as a place to buy electronics and computers, and turned into, in the 90s, with the rise of otaku culture, into a mecca for people part of this subculture to gather. However, starting in the early 2000s, otaku culture became more mainstream, particularly with this idea of Cool Japan, which was a government marketing campaign to promote Japanese popular culture, particularly anime and manga, as a form of soft power. This also aligned in the US with the rise of, I would say, nerd culture in the US. And so the view of otaku as socially awkward and possibly criminally dangerous people has really changed in the past 20 years. But when Perfect Blue was made in the late 1990s, this image was still quite strong. So otaku culture is also linked with idol culture, and we see this idol culture in Perfect Blue. So Japanese idols began during the economic bubble of the 1980s. So Japan's economy rose really high during the late 80s, and then the bubble burst in the early 90s. But during this time of high economic growth and easy money, singers such as Matsuda Seiko and Koizumi Kyoko became quite popular. Also, a group called Onyako Club, produced by Akimoto Yasushi, with 50 plus members, became a huge hit in Japan. And so there's this mass idol group. But in the 1990s, idol culture began to be eclipsed by the rise of J-pop groups. And also in general, after the economic boom, there was less money being spent on these mass media groups. And this time, idol music went underground, with performers moving to more private venues to create a smaller but more dedicated fan base, particularly of male otaku who would spend money on these groups. And so this is the world that we enter in Perfect Blue. We see that the group Cham, when they're performing on these smaller venues and oftentimes top of a building somewhere. And we notice the audience is almost all male. They're taking pictures. They're this fan base that's always looking to buy the new magazine and these type of things. So at this point, the idol groups are really appealing to the otaku culture. And so this idol groups really gained more larger popularity in the 2000s with the most well-known idol group, AKB48. And it's the best-selling all-girl group franchise in Japanese history. And there are 48 girls in this group, and there's all these subgroups. So there's ones in different countries, and there's ones for girls who are younger, and it's a huge mass media production. And they have their own theater in Akihabara, and where their fans can come and watch them perform. And Akimoto, who had made this group in the 80s, took a lot of what the idol groups were doing in the 90s and used that to create AKB48. He would create these small handshake events where fans could come and buy merchandise and meet their favorite members and have them sign it. And he really worked on creating an image of the idols as little amateurish and unpolished, so that the fans could imagine that by supporting them, by cheering them on, by buying their products, that they were helping them improve and nurture them as entertainers. And one such event in 2014, one of the handshakes events, 2 group members were attacked by a fan with a saw. And there was also another famous incident in 2016 where a fan who had sent an idol repeatedly gifts and she rejected them was attacked and stabbed. And a lot of the image that the idols produce is required by contracts. So the girls who enter these groups oftentimes aren't allowed to have a boyfriend, or there are really strict rules about what they can wear to create this image. And when they get to a certain age, they can have, they graduate from it and go on oftentimes to movies or television, or retire from the public life. So that's about all I have for now. I saw that we have some questions, so I'm eager to get to those.
Yeah, actually, the first question is on the topic. It came through before you started talking about otaku, but it's about otaku. You sort of addressed it, but I thought I'd ask the question anyway in case you have things to add. So Lydia Creech asks, can you talk about Kon's relationship with fandom? He's quite harsh on quote-unquote otaku characters across all of his works. He makes anime, but it's not stereotypical.
Yeah, it's interesting because, like I said, in his blog, he interacted a lot, right? So he was active in that, but he didn't himself have a huge interest in anime and manga, and so he probably would not have considered himself as a otaku or making films necessarily for otaku. And again, he was more of a film buff, and we see him. He is a filmophile, and you can see this really clearly in Millennium Actress, but also in a number of his films where there's a point of view character who serves a stand-in for Kon in his love of films. So I don't think he necessarily saw himself as part of otaku culture, but he was a film nerd, and I think he sees himself also in fandom to some extent. But this tension between celebrities and fandom comes out throughout his films. And so I do think it's something that, and I'm gonna say he is more critical necessarily than the general image of otaku at the time, but I think he played into the media's perception of otaku, particularly in Perfect Blue. Like I said, this was sort of at the time when the subculture was viewed in this really super negative light.
Please do, everyone in the audience. Like I said, don't be shy about putting your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom. But I do still have another as more come in. Charles Jacobson asks, what are the differences and similarities between Perfect Blue and Japanese pink films?
Interesting. Yeah, so Japanese pink films, a lot of times in the 60s and 70s. I think one of the questions is, and I mean, and this is with pink films also, criticism about like essentially exploitative films, right? And how sexuality is expressed. And I think that there are both references and connections to it, as in Satoshi is someone who loves films, both American, international, and Japanese. So I assume, I have not read about it, that he's watched these films. So I do think that's there. As how you make the lineage, I haven't really looked into that, but I do think that that's a quite interesting question, and the same worries about at what point does the depiction of rape and sexual assault become voyeuristic, right? If you're criticizing voyeurism, which arguably in some films you can make an argument, and definitely I think Cohen would make the argument in Perfect Blue that there's a criticism of voyeurism. But if the voyeurism is criticized through voyeurism, and what do you make of that? I think that's never an easy question to deal with.
Well, that actually leads to one of my own questions. I was wondering what you thought about where Perfect Blue sits in cinema history, like what you saw leading up to it, like what informed Perfect Blue, and then what came after it. And again, this is something you addressed in your presentation. You talked about how like Akira kind of cleared the runway for Perfect Blue, and also like Slaughterhouse-Five and Terry Gilliam. And then you talked about how it was a big influence on Darren Aronofsky. But it's one of those films, I feel like if you read a lot about Perfect Blue, every single person that writes about it will say something different. They'll compare it to some other thing. And the one that came to mind for me when I watched it last night, and it's related to Charles's question that he just asked, is like 5 or so years ago, the Japanese director Shion Sono directed a film called Anti-Porno, which I like to joke. It was from the Roman porno reboot from 5 or so years ago. But yeah, I've told people that it's sort of like if Michael Haneke directed a softcore film using Pedro Almodovar's color palette. It's sort of, but it bears a lot of similarity to where it sort of interrogates, I don't know, like the slippage between, fiction and reality, and dreaming and waking and things like that. But yeah, separate from that film, it's just my own observation. What all do you see leading into Perfect Blue, and where do you see its influence after the fact?
Yeah, so I think one thing that the reason that some people approach it in different ways or sort of different influences is that Kon is an auteur, and he, in some ways, his films, in my opinion, stand as their own thing, particularly within Japanese anime. And I think their place in terms of Japanese anime and Japanese film and anime, it's to broaden who would watch a animated film, and allows for more people to do that and to understand the possibilities. But I don't see it as necessarily he did this and other people were following his footsteps necessarily. And the same thing with Akira is that although Kon wrote on the shirt tails, essentially his film is very, very different, in style very different than anything that's done in Akira, and the concerns are quite different too. And like I said, I think you see influences very directly in terms of both themes. For instance, Hitchcock obviously comes up, his themes of doppelgangers and in Psycho and in various other films very much come up in Perfect Blue. And like I said, in Brazil, if you watch the dream sequences in Brazil, a lot of times you have these match cuts on movement, where the main character moves in a real world to fantasy and back and forth. And you can see this a lot. But I think it's more of what he liked, these influences in what he liked, as opposed to necessarily you can draw a line in Japanese animation or in American film and his influence that way. If that, I don't know if that's sort of a cop out, but.
No, I think that's perfectly fair. And to that point, I should have brought this up earlier, but I didn't think about it. A lot of people compare Perfect Blue specifically to the work of Dario Argento. And Argento, of course, was a contemporary of Lucio Fulci, who we just finished with last month. But if you read interviews with Cohn from around the time of Perfect Blue's release, more than one interviewer would ask him about Argento, and he had never seen an Argento film at that point. So at that point, he went back and watched Argento, and he's like, oh yeah, I kind of like this guy. So there is kind of an affinity there, but just coincidental. It's nothing more than that.
And in his blog, Cohn would talk about his films, oftentimes lists like, these are the films I'm watching, or this is what I'm interested in. And so he was a film buff as opposed to someone who watched and interacted with a lot of anime. So but I also think that, as a film buff who ticks some different areas, it wasn't necessarily a systematic approach to, I'm going to look at these movements of film, as opposed to these are things I like, and then people have recommended this and that sort of approach, which I think, mini film, fanatics can relate to.
Yeah, I do like that game. Like I was saying, that if you read much about Perfect Blue, just everybody compares it to something else. Basically, yeah. There's not really a consensus. So back to Lydia Creech. She says, "What about similarities between Perfect Blue and '90s Hollywood erotic thrillers? Does he cite any references there?"
I haven't seen any references, but I wouldn't say they're not there. I haven't read all of his blog posts about him. He has lots of them, and also different times, different interviews, he'll say slightly different things, as I think many filmmakers are bound to do in terms of interpretation and influences.
I'd be interested, Lydia, if something came to your mind, like if there was a specific film or films that prompted that question. But as Lydia might be typing in an answer to that question, Alexandra Rigby says, Cohn said the meaning of the title Perfect Blue was lost in translation from novel to film, but invited fans to give it their own interpretation. What is yours?
Yeah, that's I mean, I actually have not looked into the title that much. I haven't read the original work of the novel, and I would assume that would inform it. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that. I don't know if you've read any sort of interpretations or.
I did, and I'm not remembering it off the top of my head. I'm sorry. I feel like it's like a Clockwork Orange, where there is like kind of a distinct, like it does sort of mean something else, but I'm just not remembering it. While I rack my brain and see if I can come up with it, we've got a question from Ethan Halker, he's our presenter 2 weeks from now. I should have mentioned before, I am going to butcher every Japanese name, so I apologize for that. But Ethan says, how much do you see Oshii Mamoru's influence on Cohn? I'm aware that they worked together previously on Pot Labor 2, but I see a more substantial influence on Cohn's filmmaking from Oshii than even Otomo.
Yeah, no, I definitely think there is an influence. I'm thinking of like what's the series name? Pat Labor. And I can see, like, again, Ultimo influence, I think, is getting him there, and I don't see the like actual animation style. It's quite different. And I think that the animation style and sort of themes do have more influence in Ultimo. I think that Oshii does. So I would definitely agree there. But I would also say that his directing style, particularly his cuts and how he does that, for me at least, is not particularly influenced by Japanese animation at the time.
So at the moment, we're caught up with audience questions, so keep on putting them in, guys. But for another question of my own, I was wondering, a lot of like the cultural discourse in just like in 2021, basically, has been around the new documentary framing, but Britney Spears, and just in the past like week or so, we've had the I don't know, furor, for lack of a better word, over Billie Eilish's Vogue cover shoot. But a lot of it's about, you know, like the agency of 19-year-old pop stars, and like how they can control their image or how they maybe can't control their image. Do you see this film as looking forward to that type of thing? Was it an issue then? Or like, I don't know, was it prescient in that way?
Yeah, I think that I think that is an issue with idol culture around young women throughout, since that's been a thing. But I think even more so than necessarily Britney Spears, I would put towards online, hyper online influencers. And this idea of the avatar, your online image versus your actual image, which in 1997, the online image was very small, right? There wasn't much. You had some blogs. This is before YouTube, Google, etc. And so I think that for me, this idea of a self we create, that an online self, or the creation of that, and then the actual, for me, was the most prescient thing. And I was recently watching interviews with social media influencers who had watched it for the first time, and they're basically saying, yeah, this is something that I directly connect with this. So just larger, even necessarily, or more specific than pop idols or the mass media presentation, is that online and that sort of online subculture that now is just culture, and the way that image gets created through it.
So we heard back from Lydia. To return to her question, the original question was, what about similarities between Perfect Blue and 90s era Hollywood erotic thrillers? Does he cite any references? And I asked if there was anything that specifically came to mind that prompted her to ask that question. She says, I guess I was thinking about De Palma works like Body Double, which is not the 90s. She says it's not the 90s. It wasn't me. I'm making a catty aside. Don't worry. But y'all have already talked about the influence of Hitchcock on Cohen, who was also a big flag for De Palma. Do you have anything further to add to that?
Yeah, I'd be interested to see if it's a direct connection that Cohen was influenced by something like Body Double, or that they're both taking the same influences from Hitchcock. And Cohen watched a lot of films and was a big, like I said, big film fanatic, so I wouldn't be surprised. But I think he's drawing from a diverse range, and I don't think we really can pin down a single, say this is his most direct influence. Especially because he was influenced by a large time period of films.
So again, this is something you've kind of addressed, but I wanted to return to it. What is Cohen up to? Like you talked about it when you were discussing the way he uses match cuts, where he'll juxtapose Mima on the stage as an idol versus Mima just in like banal everyday life, like buying groceries and laying around her house. Like, what's he going for with that?
So I argue that at that point in her life, the idol and the self, the public and the private, are distinct. And so you have these really interesting matches on action, but there's no confusion of where we are. We're in a supermarket and we're on stage. The color palette is almost opposite of each other. The sound is completely different. Even sort of her own persona. And so there's a very sharp distinction there. Later on, when we get the same sort of cuts, we get lost of where we are, especially the on-screen versus the off-screen, and the dreaming versus the reality. So I think establishing that distinction in the beginning, and then the breakdown of it, and the reestablishment of her identity at the end, is one of the things that he's up to there.
So I have another question from Ethan. Ethan says, sort of drawing on your previous thoughts on the depiction of sexual violence in the film, do you think it's at all hypocritical for Cohen to draw on these risque elements to help sell the film when it was to be released as an OVA in the fashion of other films that were marketed toward otaku, like Megazone 23 or Doomed Megalopolis? Or does this depiction read as more of a subversion of that exploitation?
Yeah, I'd be interested to see about like the advertising around it, because obviously, how much control he had over that would be an interesting question. At least in what I know about it, when it was marketed as for international audiences, so it was sent to film festivals and marketed as a more an upscale film, right? One that is presenting these sexual violence, but it's doing artistically. So, how it was marketed and who is he trying to sell it to? And it was that different if he's selling it to a public Japanese market who's going to be otaku, OVA, or if he's selling it towards a international market, and in terms of its, because it ends up being released as in theaters, but I would have to look at those decisions and who's making those, and at what points. Because I know that it at certain points how it was gonna be was slightly changed during its production. So
you and I talked about this in the lead up to the event before many people had logged on. You were worried that some of the questions would be along the lines of, so this one scene, what happens here? And like, those are hard questions to answer in regards to this movie. I'm curious though, just kind of in general terms, say that someone sees this film for the first time and they need it explained to them, like they feel it, like they don't get it within the logic strictly of the film. Like say, like how explicable is it? Like, is there a sort of objectively true answer in the world of the film, or is it just inexplicable?
I think if you watch a couple times, it's fairly explainable. Like, I don't think there are any of these things that are like, oh, this person's dead, but wait, this person should be alive here. These type of plot holes. But I also think that it wraps itself up in a way that like things happen from here to here, and you don't really need to know exactly what it is. But at the end, Rumi is in the mental hospital. Mima has gotten her sort of personality back. And who's dead, right? And so there's this point where things break down and a point where they return. And whether you map out every little detail of what happens here, if you get from here to here and you understand the breakdown that you're supposed to be discombobulated, you're supposed to be questioning, I think that's more the important part. I've never been a huge person of like, I'm going to make sure I know every single detail as opposed to, is there this arc and where does it begin and end personally?
I should probably put in the last call for questions. We're starting to run out of time, but I've got another audience question here. So while I'm asking this one, if you have any burning questions, now's a good time to put them in, because otherwise we're likely to miss them. Tim Sullivan, who's a great ex-Webster student, he graduated, not dropped out. He asks, from revisiting Cohn's films over the last couple of years, from revisiting Cohn's films over the last couple of years, the film that felt to me like a sort of companion piece to Perfect Blue is Millennium Actress. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think that in terms of we look at a lot about fandom and celebrities, and Millennium Actress really approaches this, but I feel it's more of a celebration, in my sense, more of a positive film, and it gives I see it not necessarily as an opposite side of a coin, but definitely a companion piece, and seeing that a celebration of movie history and of celebrities in a certain way.
Well, I mentioned this is something we'll talk about next week, but I think it's worth pointing out, since you've talked about it a lot, sort of a reference point for the lead role in Millennium Actress is Setsuko Hara, the great Yasujiro Ozu actress. She's the daughter Noriko in Tokyo Story, and the daughter Noriko in Late Spring, and the daughter Noriko in Early Summer, etc. Ozu had that same thing that Cohn does, to where like he didn't feel like he had to hold your hand through every single thing. Like he would cut over like seemingly major events where, like the whole movie would be leading up to a wedding, and then he would skip over the wedding and suddenly they're married, and you're like, why did we not see the wedding? But I think Cohn does sort of a similar thing. But yeah, like I said, that's a topic probably better to discuss next week. So Elsa, you've been warned. We're going to talk about Ozu next week. For now, I think I've got one more question, then I should probably wrap up. Again, it's from Lydia. Lydia says, the big emotional arc is basically her reconciling her personality, right? It's very Freudian. So I don't know if I feel like the nitty-gritty details and timeline really need to be explicitly nailed down. Is that something you agree with?
Yeah, that's basically how I feel. We know at what point things break down, and we know, at least I feel at the end, that they have come back together. And we know that there's trauma. We know that there's these certain events happen. I think that's the important part. And even more importantly, our point of view character, Mima, doesn't know what is real and not there. And we're not supposed to either. We're not supposed to be in a superior position at points. We're supposed to be put into that, and not put into it in a way of us trying to solve it, because it moves through the stuff. It doesn't ask us to figure out the whodunit. And for me, that's not what is being asked of the viewer. And so, not to say that's wrong to do, and I think many people get pleasure out of that, but I don't think that the film necessarily asks us those questions. That is, figure this out, who did it, multiple rewatchings, and maybe, I think it can't multiple rewatches you will get different things, but I don't necessarily think that it's a film that after multiple rewatchings you'll understand the key to figuring out the meaning, right? I think that your first few through it, usually you get that sort of emotional catharsis and thing.
One of the films I often see it compared to is Persona, the great 1966 Ingmar Bergman film, but it follows kind of a similar logic to where like it feels like if you watch it enough, it'll eventually make some kind of definitive sense, but I'm not sure that that's really what it's even trying for in the first place. But that all said, we're out of time now. So thank you everyone for coming, and I hope you return next week for Millennium Actress. And Adam, soon to be Dr. Manfredi, I appreciate your taking the time to talk about Perfect Blue with us. It's been a real pleasure.
I'm looking forward to the rest of the lectures and hope I started out on a good foot.
Thanks again, everyone.